The Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College presents 10 years of best-selling authors and great thinkers.
My name is Frumkes. I'm the director, and as you know, we still have, in November, we have Catherine Vaz, who will be coming to speak, beautiful young author sitting in the first row, and Richard Letter is flying in from California to give a Shakespearean performance, one-man show that will dazzle you. I can promise you that. Unfortunately, Peter Green and his wife Sharon could not be here tonight, the benefactors of this evening, but I assured them that we have a quite wonderful speaker and that I would tell them all about it. And as you know, when Chris finishes talking, he is happy to come over here and inscribe books for any of you who would like him to do so. And then we have refreshments in the back, as we always do for you. So that done, let me tell you a little about Chris Cerf. I think I know a little bit about him. I never know too much about anyone. During the late 1800s, when I first met Chris Cerf up at Harvard, there was a writer of a certain kind of suspense novels called Robert Ludlum. He wrote books like The Scarlatti Inheritance, The Osterman Weekend, and later The Bourne Identity. It was around that time that Chris Cerf, author and satirist and co-founder of the National Lampoon, told me that he and his writing partner, Henry Beard, had decided to do a spoof of the Ludlum novels entitled The Heimlich Maneuver. He told me this one night as he was leaving in black tie to attend a party at the Lampoon Castle with the Radcliffe Publishing girls. I may have my facts a little off, but Chris leads that kind of life. Somewhat charmed, somewhat fey, somewhat funny, yet one of enormous accomplishment. He is a legitimate polymath. As the son of Bennett Cerf, the founder of Random House Publishing, Chris could have frittered his life away as a playboy or latter-day Gatsby, but instead, he spent 8 years at Random House working with authors such as Andy Warhol, Abby Hoffman, Ray Bradbury, George Plimpton, and Dr. Seuss. In 1993, he assumed the role of chairman of Modern Library's Board of Directors. He subsequently edited and produced Marlowe Thomas and Friends to Be, a family book, album, and TV special. The book reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Thomas and Cerf continued their collaboration, and after winning a Grammy Award in 2006 for one of their projects, donated the profits to St. Jude's Research Hospital for Children, founded by Marlowe's father, Danny Thomas. Since its first season in 1970, Chris has played a significant role in the creation and production of the Sesame Street television program, especially as a regular contributor of music and lyrics. In the process, he won 2 Grammy Awards, 3 Emmy Awards for songwriting and music production. As if this were not enough, Chris served as a founder and original editor-in-chief of Sesame Workshop's Books, Records, and Toys division. Currently, Chris serves as executive producer of Between the Lions, a children's literacy series that his company, Serious Thinking Limited, created and which has won 6 Emmy Awards. Chris continues to break new ground in TV children's programming all the time, but he will tell you about Lomax, the Hound of Music, and other more recent projects if he wishes. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to present our 2016 Jack Burston Memorial Lecturer for the Hunter College Writing Center, Chris Cerf. Okay, young fellow.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Louis. I don't think I can cover quite all of that, tonight, but I'm going to try to focus on three little parts of it that I think might be fun and interesting, I hope. My early days at Random House, and before that, my dad's early days at Random House. I know Barbara here has brought one of my dad's old books, which touched my heart, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the early days of Random House. Then I'm going to talk a little about the TV part, Sesame Street and Between the Lions. My good friend Rob Gardner, who worked with me on Lions all those years, sneaked in here tonight. I'm thrilled to see him, so thanks, Rob. And I'm going to talk finally about how the humor ties all this together a little bit, and about the recent book that I've done with Henry Beard. Lewis mentioned an early work with Henry, the Heimlich maneuver, which we never did get around to writing. But I can tell you that the idea was that people were going to be choked by a brilliant killer chef who made the beef stroganoff just a little too big. But in any case, Henry and I have a recent book called Spinglish, the Definitive Dictionary of Deliberately Deceptive Language, which is, we think, quite apropos for this campaign season. So I'm going to finish up talking about that. Now, these jobs may sound disconnected, but I'm going to argue that they actually are very related, and that the broad interests I have kind of went together to make all this possible. I never think of stopping doing one thing and doing something else. They're all part of the same continuum. But I also think that these oddly different jobs sort of show how publishing has changed a bit because of all the new media that we've seen. Even television didn't exist yet when Random House started in 1927. And of course, now we have the internet and video games and ebooks and all kinds of things. But I'm also going to argue that though it's changed some, it hasn't changed as much as some people worry about. In fact, publishing has absorbed a lot of these jobs and is still, in many ways, similar to what it always was. But getting started with that, I'm going to do what I said and go back to the 20s and talk a little bit about Random House in the early days, mainly because it's fun. My dad, as many of you may remember, was a great character. Some people remember him for his TV work, What's My Line? But actually, his day job, and the one he cared desperately about, was running Random House, which he co-founded. A lot of people always ask me how Random House started and how it's got its name, which is rather an odd name. And there's a good story behind that, so I'm going to start with that. My dad was working in 1925 in his first job in publishing for a company called Boni and Liverite, which was an amazing publisher of the time. They published people like E. Cummings and Theodore Dreiser. They published T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, remarkable publisher. And Richard Simon was there too, who started Simon & Schuster, as well as my dad. But it was an interesting and odd place because Horace Liverite, the owner, was kind of a playboy, and he would go through money incredibly quickly. And he depended upon his father-in-law to keep funding the company whenever it was about to go bankrupt, which was quite often. But part of the problem was that being a playboy, he was cheating on his wife the whole time, which didn't make his father-in-law, who had to lend him all this money, particularly happy. So one day, and my dad was still in his 20s, Horace Liverite took my dad out to lunch at 21, which was then called Jack and Charlie's. It was a speakeasy during Prohibition. And Liverite had a few drinks and said to my dad, you know, I wish I could get my father-in-law out of this business. He's driving me crazy. I don't have enough money. And my dad sort of kiddingly said, Horace, why don't you sell me the Modern Library? The Modern Library was the famous reprint line that Boni and Liverite started and was the backbone of the business. Despite all their famous authors, this is where their money was. My dad was kind of kidding when he said it, but Liverite said, okay, I'll do it. That's a great idea. My dad was shocked. He didn't have the money to buy it, But he said, I better do this. It's an incredible opportunity. And his buddy Dick Simon had just gone off to start Simon & Schuster, and he was jealous of him. So he thought, maybe this is my chance. So they went back to Liverite's office, and Liverite started to tell everybody in the company that he was selling the Modern Library. Julian Messner, who was the number 2 at Pony and Liverite then, and became a famous publisher on his own. For those of you of a certain age may remember Messner and Company. But in any case, Julian thought this was the worst idea he'd ever heard, and rightly so, from Liverite's point of view. But just as he was talking Liverite into not making this deal, Liverite's assistant came running in and said, there's a man downstairs with a pistol who wants to kill you, he says, because you've been cheating on his wife, he claimed. You've been cheating on, having an affair with his wife. So Liverite sent Messner down to deal with this guy because Messner knew him. And that eliminated my father's main rival in this discussion. And apparently, though my dad was known to exaggerate his story a bit, but taking him at his word, that was the way he was able to convince Liverite to go through with this. So he and his buddy Donald Klupfer from Random House managed to raise the money. They had some, and Donald had some from his dad's business, and they found the money to buy the Modern Library, and it became a big success for them. So they ran that for a couple of years very well, but then they began to get bored because it was all reprints, and they weren't getting to have any fun publishing their own books. So they said, why don't we publish 2 or 3 extra books a year at random? And that's where the name came from, Random House. And I've always loved that story, and it's true. So the next story I want to tell is very related to that, because one of the first books at random that Random House decided to publish was James Joyce's Ulysses. That was not an easy thing to do. Joyce already had a publisher and was usually successful, but Ulysses had been banned here as an indecent book, and nobody was allowed to publish it or even, at least technically, bring it into the country. So my dad actually, on not quite a whim, but he said, what have I got to lose? Traveled to Paris with the idea that if he could talk Joyce into this, he was going to try to publish the book, even though Random House was tiny, just starting, and didn't have a lot of money at its disposal. So he went to Paris, met Joyce, and promised him in advance, even though they had no way of knowing if the book could ever be published. Joyce, which was, I guess, quite frequent an event with him, was pretty broke at the time and decided that a several $1,000 advance would be great if my dad was, as he put it, crazy enough to take this on. So my dad came back with the permission to publish Ulysses. The only problem was, of course, that he knew that if he tried to, they would probably seize all the copies and Random House would go bankrupt. So they had to figure out a way to do this some other way. And what my dad decided to do was to have someone get caught smuggling the book into the country, and that maybe that would be the way to win the lawsuit before he took the chance of publishing the book. And he also knew, and this is where my father was pretty clever, I have to admit, he was pretty clever anyway, but he knew that there was a law at that time, I guess because his lawyers told him, that in a censorship case, you could not bring outside critics into the case to talk about the literary worth of a book. You had to go only by the content of the book and whether that was obscene or not. So my father had the idea that the copy they would smuggle in would have some extra pages, that he would paste into the book all the great literary reviews that Ulysses had gotten, so they would be part of the book and then be admissible as evidence. And they carefully prepared this book and brought it over, I think on the Queen Mary it was. He had a friend of his who was traveling back carry the book in his suitcase so that it would be seized and this great trial could occur. The problem was that it was an extraordinarily hot day when the ship arrived. And when the guy got to customs, they said, "You can go right on through. we don't need to open your bag. You're fine." So the man that was carrying the book had to say, "No, no, no. I'm a law-abiding citizen. I insist that you open my bag and search it carefully." And I guess after quite a bit of argument, the guy agreed to do it. And then he looked through it and said, "You're fine. I told you were fine. I told you you're fine. Go right on through." And the guy said, "No, no, no. Look at this book. It's illegal. It's Ulysses. You're not allowed to bring that. I'm not allowed to bring that in." And the customs guy said, "Yeah, I don't pay any attention to that. Everybody brings it in." But the man insisted that they seize it. And luckily for my father and for literature, they did seize it. So it became the centerpiece of an indecency trial, which Random House won. So without having to spend the money of publishing an unpublishable book, they got permission to do it, and the rest is history. I like that. I wonder if a publishing house would have the chance to be that crazy these days. I question whether the big ones would, but I'm glad that Random House did. I'm going to tell you one last little story about my dad, because it again shows how a small publisher with enough nerve and humor can get out of a tough situation. This is about a book that my dad published in the 50s, early 50s, by Quentin Reynolds, who some of you may know was a famous war correspondent. And he had found a man in Canada who was part of the French resistance, who had been captured by the Germans and never revealed anything about the resistance, was a great hero. And Reynolds wrote his biography and called it The Man Who Wouldn't Talk. It was a huge bestseller, one of Random House's biggest nonfiction bestsellers. And my dad sold it to Reader's Digest, which was a big deal. Those rights used to be sold for a lot of money. And he sold it for Reader's Digest to Reader's Digest for a record price. But then it turned out one day that the book turned out to be a total hoax, that this guy made up the story. He was a great imposter, a con man, and that none of it was true. And this was not a happy day at Random House. And my father decided he had to do something about it, so he held a press conference. And he got up in front of all these bemused but perhaps hostile reporters and said, "Before we begin the questions, I have two announcements to make. One is that I've asked the New York Times to move The Man Who Wouldn't Talk from the nonfiction list to the fiction list. And secondly, we're changing the title of the book from The Man Who Wouldn't Talk to The Man Who Talked Too Much." And then he sat down. They made him stand up again and answer some questions, but he did diffuse the moment. And again, that's an example of what I think publishing used to be, that it still can be, but perhaps in the big corporate companies it isn't quite that way so much anymore. But we're going back to smaller imprints, companies like Riverhead, which is actually part of a Random House that's 50,000 times bigger, almost literally, than Random House was when my dad was there and when I started working there. They're doing the kind of publishing that I'm talking about, so it is still possible. Now I want to skip ahead a little bit to my first time at Random House, because it leads to the Sesame Street part of the story. When I got out of college, I got a job working for beginner books, which my mom started with Dr. Seuss. You may remember that Dr. Seuss wrote a book called The Cat in the Hat, but you may not remember how that came to be. There was a big scandal after Sputnik went up in 1957 that the Russians were better educated than Americans. And John Hersey wrote a famous piece in Life magazine, which I think was titled Why, that eventually became a book by someone else, but the title of the article was Why Ivan Can Read and Johnny Can't. And Hersey made the point that Dick and Jane books were the problem, in part, that they had controlled vocabularies that kids could handle, and that was all great. but they were so boring that kids couldn't stand to read them. And he said, why doesn't someone like Dr. Seuss take that same word list and write an amusing book with those same words? And Ted Geisel, who, as many of you know, is Dr. Seuss's real name, took the challenge and wrote The Cat in the Hat. My mom had the idea that Random House did publish Seuss already, and my mom had known Ted even before that. She had the idea that he could do lots of books this way, some even simpler. And Random House's juvenile department didn't think so, but my mom convinced Ted that it was possible. And at that point, my dad bet Ted he couldn't write a book with fewer than 75 words instead of the 300 that had been in The Cat in the Hat. And he wrote Green Eggs and Ham as a result, which is one of the next early beginner books. And Ted said to his dying day that my dad never paid the bet, but I think they both made enough money on that book to make it okay. In any case, I was lucky enough somehow to get a job at Random House at that time, working with my mom and Dr. Seuss. It was all my skill, I think. I had no luck involved at all. But in any case, something that really changed my life happened one day early in that experience when Ted Geisel came rushing into the office with a new idea. And that idea was, I want to do an alphabet book with letters standing for verbs instead of adjectives. We've all seen books with A is for apple and B is for boy, but how about doing one where the letters stand for verbs? We all got incredibly excited because we'd never seen a book like that. But after about 5 minutes thought, we realized why nobody had seen a book like that. Because it's almost impossible in a still picture to draw a picture of a verb that is unmistakably what you're trying to draw, and also that kids, just looking at the book, would know was the meaning rather than the noun that you also had to picture. For example, if you say R is for run and you show a girl running, you might think that R is for girl rather than R is for run. So he didn't do it. But later, as Sesame Street came on the air, and I got recruited to go there, I realized that Sesame Street could solve that verb problem for Dr. Seuss, because on Sesame, in that medium, we had animation and audio. So even though people thought it was weird to use TV to teach literacy, in some ways it actually was better. And that was a great lesson to me, and one that I want to show you a little bit more about by jumping ahead many years. I went to Sesame. My dad was a little hurt by that at first, but luckily Donald Klupfer, who always picked up the pieces, said, well, if you hate Sesame, even if your dad won't take you back, I'll give you a job. And I knew that my dad would, but also Sesame agreed to pay me more than my dad would. So that was another reason. But the main reason I went was that I thought I had gone to Sesame thinking that we could do books at Random House with them, and they said, let's do them, but why don't you do them from here? And luckily for me, even though I started doing that, Joe Raposo, genius music director and composer for Sesame, had gone to Harvard with me and knew that I could write rock and roll. And though he had studied with Nadia Boulanger and was a brilliant composer, one of the most brilliant I've ever known, he didn't know rock and roll very well. So he let me try my hand on it on the side, and I never stopped. It was a big thrill that sneaked me into the music business. And I got to write scripts and everything as well. And I kept doing the books and records all the way through, or for many years as well. But all this led to my wanting eventually, with several of my Sesame Street colleagues, and Mr. Gardner here is one of them, to want to do our own show that didn't just teach all kinds of things for preschoolers, but really tried to tackle literacy, reading itself. And of course, everybody made fun of us at first, teach kids to read by having them not read books but watch TV, right? But educators, you heard the verb story already about Dr. Seuss. A lot of educators realized there were a lot of things we could do to teach reading on television or with interactive video materials that you can't do in a book. I'm going to tell you about a few of those, and then I'm going to show you a few clips from Between the Lines, again, because they're fun, but I think they illustrate better than my telling you what you can do on TV that you really can't do just in a book or in a classroom without animation or audio. One is that you can illustrate text as it's being read. You can highlight the word as it's being read and show the association between spoken language and written language. You can do that if you have a big book and kind of point at the words, but TV is much better at it. You can also, and this is one of the things that Marilyn Adams, one of the great reading experts in the country, asked us to try to do on Between the Lines, is to illustrate blending. That's a jargon concept from education, but what it basically means is putting two sounds together to make a word, or putting letters or groups of letters together to make a word. And it's very hard to get that concept across. Some teachers try to do it with flashcards by having the letters here and putting them together, or you can write letters on the blackboard and then erase them and put them closer together. But it's not ideal. But on TV, we realized that we could have Monty Python-style nights run together at high speed, holding parts of words, crash them together, and then once they had done it, act out the meaning of the word, too. Another thing we could do is actually change one letter at a time in a word to show what effect that letter has on a word. When that's done in a classroom, we learned that the technical term for that is slotting. And I learned that that came from the way a slot machine changes one thing without necessarily changing the things in the other windows. I assume that the person who named this had spent a little too much time in Las Vegas, but it's still, it was a very useful concept for us. And finally, the music that I mentioned is a fantastic way to teach rote things like sounds, the sounds of letters. Rote learning can be kind of boring, but it doesn't have to be. You could teach a letter rules about letters or letter sounds in a silly song. Kids might remember the lyrics and then they'll remember the lesson too. But even if it gets repetitive, they'd rather hear the song many times than the lesson many times. So I'm going to show you 3 or 4 little tiny pieces, each only less than a minute long, from Between the Lines that all teach the short E sound. One of them is those knights running together with an E word. Then I'm going to show you an incredible man named Fred Newman. How many of you have ever listened to Garrison Keillor's show? A lot of you. So you may know there's a guy on that show that does crazy sounds with his mouth and does sound effects for Garrison's stories. That's Fred Newman. And we realized that Fred would be amazing at teaching phonics because he can make all the sounds of the letters, but also the sounds of the words. So we got him to teach something. Then we have a slotting sequence using robots that look like a slot machine. And finally, a song with the E sound. So I'm going to run these for you now.
And now it's time for...
Gawain's Word! Gawain's Word! Excellent! Gawain here once again at Blending Fields, where 2 brave knights in armor will charge together at high speed and make a word. Competing today we have Sir... And on your right, Sir, Et. Blend on, dudes. Wet. Excellent. That's Gawain's word for today. And this is Gawain saying, you bet. I'll see you next time on Gawain's Word.
Wet, wet.
This is the slotting, of course.
Pen. Hen.
Fred Newman.
Oh. Good, good. N. Yeah. N. 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 Hen.
Hen.
And now, lovers of the vowels A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y, the Vowels are in the house singing the short E sound from their sensational hit word, men!
So there you have it. That last group, by the way, were the vowels. They can only sing vowel sounds on Between the Lines. If they wanted to make a whole word, they had to meet up with a crooner named Johnny Consonanti, who could only sing consonants. But he was a very lowbrow kind of guy and took all the credit. But as you can see, we had a lot of fun, and not only doing Sesame, but doing Lions, because we had amazing music talent. We just didn't get so-called kiddie artists. The singers on that E song include one of the main backup singers for the Rolling Stones, and the lead was Paulette McWilliams, who sang with Luther Vandross in Motown for years. So that's part of the fun of this, that we got to work with all kinds of amazing people from many media while we're doing it. So I'm going to show you one last thing from Lions before we move on, because I mentioned Dick and Jane before and how Dr. Seuss tried to improve on it and certainly succeeded. I hope I can find it. Let's see. Oh, yeah. And we did a parody on Lions of Dick and Jane, but we realized to make it interesting, we would put Dick and Jane, who we had to call Scott and Dot because Scott Forsman wouldn't let us call them Dick and Jane. We had to put them in danger, but we didn't change the affect of the characters at all. They didn't notice they were in danger. Only their pet chicken, whose name was Chicken Jane, which was a name we were allowed to use, would notice that there was any problem. So I'm going to show you a short Chicken Jane episode, which shows you how we put text on the screen and highlighted it as it was read, but also packed dozens of short A words into one little skit, because that's what we were teaching that day.
And now, fun with Chicken Jane. Today, Chicken Jane and the Fat Cat.
Look, see, coming down the lane. Here comes Scott, here comes Dot, here comes Chicken Jane.
Look, Scott, look at that. I see a cat. Yes, Dot, I see the cat. The cat is fat. Look, Scott, look. That fat cat is an acrobat. Look, Dot, look. See Chicken Jane write the letters S-C-A-T. Scat, scat, scat. Scat, Scott, scat. Scat, Dot, scat. Look at that. The fat cat went splat. Chicken Jane is flat. Yes, Chicken Jane is flat. We are not flat. Thank you, Chicken Jane.
Look, see, going up the lane. There goes Scott, there goes Dot, there goes Chicken Jane.
Anyway, an amusing aspect to that was that PBS was worried that we injured the chicken, and which I understand. So what we did that for some reason they thought made it okay, which it probably didn't, was that we had a message at the end of every episode of Between the Lines saying that no animated chickens had been injured during the making of the program. So anyway, now I'm going to skip ahead to the third part of my little career, which is the humor books. As you can see, some humor and parody has been involved in everything that I've tried to do. But the more recent one, most recent example is a book that I did with Henry Beard, as I said. Here it is, called Spanglish, the Definitive Dictionary of Deliberately Deceptive Language. And actually, we didn't make up anything in this book. It's actually researched examples of all the words that business, politics, and everybody use to try to deceive you, and of course, which you can also use to deceive others. So it can be a how-to manual if you choose to use it that way. But basically, Spanglish, which is obviously a combination of spin and English, is the language that people use when they've done something awful and don't want to admit it, or they want to lull you into embracing something totally dreadful, or they just want to tell it like it isn't, because they've been lying a lot. Now, this campaign has made all of this academic because it's so much over the top that we don't even need to do this anymore. But I'm going to explain it anyway. A good example is right here on the cover, where the publishers identify us as semi-best-selling satirists. Semi is a great example of Spanglish because it means not. For example, think about a semi-private hospital room. You will discover that if you've been in a hospital, that a semi-private hospital room has as many as 5 other patients in beds right next to you. But today's hospitals, or they prefer to call them wellness centers now, because they don't want to admit they deal with illness in any way. They prefer the term semi-private rather than private. Similarly, a very similar word is virtually. You used to see commercials like, this dishwashing liquid will get your crockery virtually spotless. That means there will still be spots on it when you take it out of the dishwasher. And in fact, our politicians use that word far more often than you think. Donald Trump, when he was still more or less speaking like a normal politician, used that in one of his early debates when he said that, I want to get the quote right, virtually all my business deals have been an amazing success. Well, 6 of them were bankruptcies, but he never mentioned those. Another term that Trump has used a lot in his campaign, and one that really bothers me because it's a term that's interested Henry and me, and we did a book about it in the past, is politically correct. To Trump, that term basically means it's a get out of jail free card. You can say that's politically correct. They're just being politically correct if they don't like what I'm saying, which means he can insult anybody, whether they're disabled, no matter what race or ethnicity they happen to be an example of. He can insult them or talk about policies that are horrible for those people and just say that anyone who disagrees is politically correct. So that's a useful term. Now, Hillary Clinton has used terms like this as well. For example, when she was confronted in one of the early debates about her illegal, if it was, I don't know whether it was, but her email server, she said it wasn't the best choice. Actually, it was a dreadful choice. Similarly, Trump saying that well, I also wanted to mention that she said that she described some of her statements when she apologized for them as being somewhat less than transparent. They were probably complete lies, but it's the same kind of thing. But anyway, this kind of terminology is hardly new. For example, Jimmy Carter, one of our favorite examples from the book, after the attempt to rescue the Iran hostages went wrong, he called the failed attempt an incomplete success when he went on television. An incomplete success meant that the helicopters were destroyed, nobody was rescued. I recommend you use that term if you have to admit that something didn't go quite right. You never fail, you had an incomplete success. Another term that came out of the Bill Clinton administration is hands-on mentoring, which is a term for having sexual relations with a junior employee. That is a remarkable term, and has new relevance, unfortunately. But I guess locker room talk is the latest version of that, which is a synonym for describing sexual assault at this point. Now, those are some political uses, but in business, you're going to find a lot of these too. Negative growth is a term I've always loved. That means you lost a lot of money, but you had negative growth, so you're a success. If you have enough negative growth, of course, you have to lay off all your employees, but God knows you could never admit that. In fact, Henry and I found more words for firing and laying off than any other word. Second was kill, by the way, but layoffs were, we found over 100 of them. A couple of my favorites were offering our employees a career change opportunity, which a company in Vermont actually said. We didn't make any of these up, as I said. You can also present someone with an early retirement if you want to. And future endeavoring somebody. That's a great example of a verb. That's another thing that language has changed into, is making nouns into verbs or adjectives into verbs. But future endeavoring somebody, as in good luck in your future endeavors, is a great term for firing. And one of my favorites altogether is involuntarily leisured, as in I'm involuntarily leisuring you, but we've sure enjoyed having you here in the company. Of course, when you're involuntarily leisured yourself, you can use Spinglish as well. You can say you've opened your own consulting firm, which a lot of us do, of course, including me, and or you can say you've embarked on a journey of self-discovery, which I fully recommend. And finally, one last term from business that I love is zero tasking. Zero tasking means doing absolutely nothing. So if you're not goofing off, you're zero tasking. Now, believe it or not, that term was made up by a highly paid business consultant who recommended to a bank that they were working their employees too hard and that they would benefit from letting them enjoy a little more zero tasking. So again, that's a great term for you to use when you get caught playing with the internet instead of doing your job. So basically that concludes what I have to say tonight. I know there are refreshments being served. I hope that you don't become tired and emotional if you drink them. That's a term that Private Eye used because they couldn't say drunk politicians without getting, they couldn't say that without getting sued for libel. And don't get overserved, which is a good way to blame Lewis if you get drunk. So thank you very much.
Let's take a few questions,
Okay,
and then you can sit over here.
Okay.
We'll take
right.
a few. Richard.
Okay, happy to.
So, our children were raised on Dr. Seuss and all of the things that you, but now our grandchildren are into playing with Sesame Street apps and
Yes.
Stuff like that. And a lot of those are pretty clever and well done too. I wondered what you thought about them. Also about one of the things that has troubled me with my grandchildren is watching them go from looking at things that have been in the early years extremely cute, extremely wonderful, to then looking to, as they get a little older, to very wise guy kinds of things that are also supposed to be educational, but are really so wise guy that they just, become wise guys. So I wondered what you thought about both of those
Well,
things.
I might ask you about that second thing again when I get to it. But the first question, I think that educational apps at their best are fantastic. Interactive learning is better than non-interactive learning always. It's better when you engage with a person. All research shows that. But not everybody, if you're a parent that works, or both parents work, or you're a single parent that works, you can engage with your child all the time. And apps, when they're well designed, can be great. Our little company, Sirius, that did Between the Lines, has been doing apps lately with a lot of the same cast members that we've worked with all along. And one of the keys to it is not just having the same answer all the time. That's right, very good, that's wrong. But try to make the characters in the app really imaginative and try to really have an incredible variety of things you can do with it. The Sesame apps are a great example of doing it right, I think. And there are many other ones too. There are also hundreds of thousands of absolutely dreadful ones. One of the problems with apps is that there's really no great screen. There are a couple of great companies that will do that, that you can look up. Jim Steyer's company, I'm drawing a blank on what it's called, but there are sites that do a terrific job of screening apps. But if you just go to the App Store, there's really no way of telling. And some are developed like Sesame is, with great educators working with really good writers and good artists, and others are just somebody that threw something together. But at best, I think it's a great development. And if they're used in connection with curricula in schools, which Success for All schools coming out of Johns Hopkins are doing, for example, they can be great. Now, I don't know exactly what you meant by Wise Guy books that you like to, what do you refer to? Yeah.
I'm just saying that all the TV shows, teach kids to be disrespectful of parents, and there's just a lot of Wise Guy kinds of.
Well, if that's what you mean, I don't like it at all. I do think that humor is good, that if you're too nice, Nelly, younger kids don't care, but older kids won't like that. But teaching disrespect, good God, I would never have worked with Marlo Thomas if I believed we should do that. Yes.
I thought your presentation was superb.
Oh, thank you.
And it rang a bell with me.
And thank you very much.
William Harrington was, and I'm going to share this with you. William Harrington was Abraham Lincoln's law partner. And in his biography of Abraham Lincoln, he mentions Lincoln would read and read aloud. And Harrington thought this was strange. And he asked Lincoln why. He said, because I could process the information, not only will I see it, but I will hear it. And your presentation rang that bell for me.
Oh, that's nice. It's never bad to be compared to Abraham Lincoln in any way. Catherine, my wonderful wife, is writing a novel now where Lincoln is a minor character, but very much so. So that's something you may have already known. But thanks. Yeah.
I just want to add that the English language, I believe, lends itself particularly well to the kind of creative phrasing that you gave us a taste of. It has a larger vocabulary than any other language, and so there is that freedom that's part of the character, I think, of Americans in particular.
I agree with that, and it applies to really a couple of things I talked about. One thing that's not always good about it is it makes it harder to learn to read because there are so many irregular words. That's the challenge we had with Lions, though it's one we happily take on. But as far as Spanglish is concerned, you are completely right. In fact, Henry made the point in the introduction to Spanglish that English is particularly good for this kind of language because it's both Latin and Anglo-Saxon. The Latin words are a great way to cover things up and make them sound better than they are because, termination with extreme prejudice sounds less harmful than I'm going to kill you. But whereas Anglo-Saxon words sound blunter, so if you want to make something sound worse, then you use that. And the abortion argument, certainly reproductive rights versus killing babies, is a great example of exactly that.
We'll take two more questions if there are two. Otherwise, Chris will be happy to.
Yes, Leslie.
Was there one?
I think Leslie had her hand. Oh, wait a minute. Oh. Okay, is that it? Oh, we have one here.
No.
Yeah.
In terms of talking using misleading terms, don't you think that a listener, by asking questions, can go beyond the terms and ultimately get the truth?
In theory, I certainly agree with that. It's been hard to do in this campaign and in many campaigns because politicians are getting more and more skilled at what is called pivoting. Okay, we use words, descriptive words like that in the book too. but changing to answer an entirely different question with the worst segue possible. Sometimes there isn't even one. If you listen carefully, you'll notice that sometimes they don't even try to answer the question. But if they do, they might say, that question reminds me of another question, or something like that. Ronald Reagan was great at that.
Thank you, Chris, for a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you, Louis.
Chris is going to sit down here, and please come up and say hello.